Good morning. How's it going, everybody? And may the 4th be with you. So my name, thank you. There's a few supporters here in the front. So my name is Andy. I'm the technical evangelist for Status. And I'm here to give you a talk today called The World Computer in Your Pockets in the Perfect Language, which might seem like a little bit of a strange title for a developers conference. But I think that we're all rapidly beginning to realize that, in fact, to have a sort of holistic view of these decentralized networks and the tools and technologies that we're building, it actually requires you to sort of incorporate some philosophy, some psychology, some language and linguistics, some game theory, some finance, and a whole bunch of other fields that are not necessarily directly related to computer science and programming, but have a stark impact in terms of how we analyze what it is we're actually doing in these networks. So this talk is more sort of an inspirational talk than a technical talk, and it's not because there's not a lot of technical things to say. There are. It's just that I really feel quite strongly that the people who are building the tools and technologies that we're going to be using in the future need to think quite critically about why it is we do what we do, what makes us get up in the morning, and why it's actually incredibly inspirational and motivational to be a part of a community like this, building the decentralized networks of the future. So I actually come from a language and linguistics background, and I spent a lot of time in my academic career sort of studying the pursuit of the perfect language, which is something that has sort of extended throughout history from the ancient Greeks and the Romans through the Middle Ages with the alchemists to various different mathematicians, philosophers, psychologists, and finally computer scientists who are interested in this kind of stuff. And like during my studies, I sort of became obsessed with this dude called Gottfried Leibniz. And Leibniz developed the calculus at the same time as Newton did. And we still use Newton's calculus, but we use Leibniz's notation. And this is because the man was absolutely obsessed with how he can fit the maximum amounts of complexity into the most succinct and simple form, right? And so he actually ended his life by suggesting that binary was perhaps the best candidate for the perfect language, right? So he'd come from like quite a theological background, and the sort of mystical nature of 0 and 1 had really sort of lit his fire. But he made the point and the arguments that binary was the only language that he knew about in which you could sort of fulfill the 3 key features of any perfect language, right? The first is that I need to be able to say exactly what I mean. Right? You need to be able to interpret exactly what I meant, and I need to be like 100% sure that you've interpreted what I meant correctly and fully, right? So if you sort of like trace this through history, it might seem like a bit of a sob story at first because, of course, Gert Gödel comes along in 1931 and proves incompleteness, right? And the corollary of incompleteness in linguistics is that it's actually impossible to achieve the perfect language. One cannot speak completely and fully the whole time. However, Alan Turing then comes along in 1936 with his now famous paper on Turing machines. And that paper, in fact, proves in a more general context what Gödel was talking about in terms of mathematical incompleteness. But Turing also managed to prove that within well-specified computational universes, you can have this notion of something called a Turing complete language. Right? And this sort of leads us to the realization that we can actually design language at the protocol layers, like right down there in the linguistic primitives, right? So a personal hero of mine, a guy called Terence McKenna, used to say that the syntactical nature of reality, the real magic of words, is that if I can learn how to make my words mean, I can learn how to make my world mean, right? And this is not just psychological babble. It actually is implementable in the real world with Turing-complete languages. So I've got a photo of Stephen Wolfram there, and he's the guy who developed Wolfram Alpha and the Wolfram language, and he actually describes himself as a language designer, right? And the best way to sort of illustrate the real and felt effect that language can have on human experience is perhaps with the movie that he was involved with recently, which is Arrival. Arrival was a sci-fi flick where sort of 12 alien ships land on Earth, and these aliens sort of squirt out in ink and speak what we call a logographic language, right? Which is where like the symbol is the meaning itself. So like in Latinate languages, and the language that I'm speaking to now in, like we encode meaning in sound, right? Even when we write things down, we sound the words out. Sound propagates linearly through space. Space is intimately linked to time. And so the languages that we speak are always already bound by time. What Arrival demonstrates quite amazingly is that if you can learn to sort of find new ways to encode meaning that do not depend on sound, right, you can quite literally come to experience time in a radically different fashion, right? And this sort of should kind of indicate to you exactly what the power of language really is in terms of altering human experience. So it's one of my favorite poets, a guy called Jalaluddin Rumi, who said that if we can learn how to speak a new language, we can make a new world, right? And like from a linguistic perspective, this is really what the people in this room are doing, right? So let's just dive into exactly what that looks like. The challenge that we all face, right, as Joe and William have sort of so beautifully laid out before you this morning, is that power in the modern world operates at the level of protocols, right? You have these massive companies who collect massive amounts of personal data on you, tracking you everywhere you go in order to improve the efficacy and accuracy of their own algorithms. So it's really sort of incumbent upon all of us to find new and alternative ways of reasserting our individual sovereignty and doing it in a way that nevertheless benefits the communities of which we are a part, right? And so the question is, practically, how do we actually achieve that in the world? And so there's this well-known economic concept of rival goods, but there was a guy called Steven Weber who actually coined the term anti-rival goods, and it was then picked up by Lawrence Lessig and Aaron Swartz when they were working on CC0. And an anti-rival good is something that I can share with you in such a way that it increases utility both for myself and for you. Right? And the best example of this, practically speaking, in the modern world is, of course, open source code. Right? Open source code is just a technically efficient means that we have of sharing linguistic innovation in such a way that everybody in the world can learn from it, build upon it, and extend what is possible, right? So what actually has to happen for us to sort of implement that in a way that it becomes transformative in society? So, I love the fact that Bitcoin and Ethereum have always sort of been referred to as magic internet money, right? It obviously has great meme value. But the point to be made here is that like magic has always been about breaking preconceptions of what is possible and increasing human deepness and virtuosity rather than just promoting raw consumerism, right? So it's worth remembering that since 2009, you've been able to store value nowhere else but in your head, walk across any border in the world, incant 12 or 24 words in a specific order into an internet-connected machine and get immediate access to value no matter where you are, right? That is magic, right? It's the definition of. And so the question is, how do we get that ability to use magic into the hands of everybody around the world? That's where Status comes in, right? So we build Ethereum into resource-restricted devices and give you access in a completely decentralized fashion to the power of these networks, right? And moreover, we do that in a way that sort of appears intuitive and easy to use to any end user. So it presents itself as an instant messenger, which is a format that people are just all around the world intimately aware of, right? I come from Africa. Everybody gets instant messages, right? They don't get long hex strings. They don't get signed data, but they definitely get instant messages. And so this is where it starts. And then obviously there's a whole bunch more, which I'm going to be talking about. In order to sort of illustrate exactly what it is that we really do, it's worth just sort of taking a look at the Ethereum Stack for a moment, because people often ask me, like, how do you guys pay for messages because you're putting them across the blockchain? And obviously we're not. We use, the whole Ethereum Stack to achieve what it is that we're building. So I've been a little bit lazy here at the bottom. I'm not sure how to do a laser pointer, but the internet itself is sort of a whole group of protocols on which we all build, and it's the internet that we know and love. And then Ethereum implements something called dev P2P above that, and that's really the transport layer, right? It's how different nodes find each other and peers sort of come to recognize each other over the network. And then there's actually 3 different sort of technical boxes that live above dev P2P, right? The first is the EVM, so the Ethereum virtual machine that we all know and love, and that's where all the consensus and blockchain stuff happens, right? So everything you read about in the mainstream media, even if CoinDesk sometimes gets it wrong, that's what's happening in the EVM, right? But there are 2 other really important and equally relevant parts to the Ethereum stack. The first is sort of Swarm, which does decentralized storage, and then Whisper, which is a decentralized peer-to-peer, dark, end-to-end encrypted gossip protocol, right? And this is what we're actually using to send messages between everybody that's using our app, right? And like the key points I think to take away from here is that it's actually the combination of technologies that makes working for Status a really, really interesting endeavor, right? Because we're able to combine completely dark private messaging with a public immutable global ledger, right? And so this is sort of like conversational commerce on steroids, right? Because we're able to achieve both privacy and sort of public immutability in terms of the transactions that you enter into. So that's pretty cool. And it's also sort of worth taking a moment to talk about like how Status is actually built, because we've sort of found that a lot of the devs that have joined us over the last year in particular have taken some time to get used to the fact that like we don't actually have any back end or front end, and we don't use any APIs, right? The whole idea here is that we have two main repos, Status React, which is actually written in a functional language called Closure and then compiled down to React Native. That's where all of the UI and UX logic happens. All of the sort of like DApps and everything that you expect sit there, and then Status Go is where like the blockchain, all of the heavy transactional logic happens, and Status Go can actually be compiled as its own sort of library, and then it gets included as a dependency in Status React, such that, you know, when we actually ship like the APK or the iOS app to you, you are running a light node on your phone, right? Which is somewhat like of a mind-boggling thing. It's a point that I'll come back to after I've sort of illustrated what this actually looks like, the communication across the native bridge in Status. You can see that in React, we sort of call like either a init jail or create account. That goes directly across the native bridge, and you can see the result of it there in Status Go. The point that I really want to make about this slide, though, is that like this is obviously magic of the technical witchcraft and wizardry kind, but it is deeply indicative of the fact that the fight for liberty, the fight for like the benefits of decentralization as they've been laid out over this whole conference really exists at the level of protocols, right? These are the linguistic primitives that we're actually using to sort of implement what is like a deeply radical concept, right? This notion of a peer-to-peer dark encrypted messenger is something that the world has not yet seen, right? So if we look at the Ethereum network visualization, if you imagine that each Status app is itself an Ethereum light node, this is what it begins to look like. Ethereum currently has about 28,000 nodes. Status has an internal testing group of about 50,000 people. So you can imagine that when we push like our sort of mainnet builds to the majority of people that have been helping us test this stuff over the last year, that number immediately pops up to about 80,000 or 90,000 nodes, and we can start talking about a properly decentralized, robust network, right? And more than this is sort of indicative of like anti-rival goods, right? Because by optimizing for decentralization and by absolutely focusing on things like privacy, not only can our users benefit from the sort of all the benefits of decentralized networks, it's also a case of making sure that the community of which we are a part is actually capable of using a network that is long-term sustainable. So it's really great. Like Whisper, when we initially implemented it, unfortunately, like a year ago, Status was sort of using 10 gigs of your mobile data a day and eating your battery in about 3 hours. But we've moved on to Whisper version 5 and now Whisper version 6. We've got it down to 10 megabytes a day. Battery consumption, especially when it's in background mode, is essentially negligible. So we're feeling really, really confident about pushing this out to that group of testers that I mentioned. We're about 60% of the way through our security audits, and we should be able to push it out in the next few months. You know, the key thing here, I think, to recognize is, like, if you look at messaging across the world, you'll see that there's an absolute mess in terms of Telegram getting banned in Iran. There's all of the sort of shenanigans going on in Russia at the moment. We don't even really need to mention WhatsApp and the data and what they've done with that. And even Open Whisper Systems and Signal, they put out a blog post the other day where Amazon and Google have essentially stopped them from doing domain fronting, which means that they can't really operate in countries where they've been censored. In addition to that, like, freedom of speech and the benefits of decentralization are not limited only to like sending messages to the people that you want to send, but in fact entering into contracts and signing transactions in such a way that they can't be censored by any intermediary, and running a light node on your phone with a seamless wallet that makes it easy to use, that hides away a lot of the sort of like abstraction that like we currently have to deal with when submitting Ethereum transactions, is the sort of key to actually taking the stuff into the mainstream. And in addition to that, because you're running your own light node, you've got your keys on your phone, you can browse to any DApp out there on Ethereum at the moment and use it just as you would with MetaMask or any of the other tools, except obviously like you're running it yourself. All of that is only sort of what's going on the left-hand side of the board. That's the Status Core app. We have a bunch of other things that we do, and unfortunately, I'm running out of time, so I'm really just going to have to rush through them. The two projects that we know about at the moment are Status Incubate and Open Bounties. There'll be another announcement coming up after this. Incubate, if you want to chat to us, Ben is in the audience. Please come and find us at the booth there. Essentially, it's about making sure that any developer building really cool D-apps have the sort of technical mentorship, the PR, the marketing, all of the expertise that we've built up in our team over the last years in the engineering and research organization to make sure that we can actually build amazing and awesome products that people can use to sort of generate value across Ethereum, because obviously that's beneficial for all of us. And then Open Bounties is a simple smart contract-based tool. You can add a GitHub app, and then any issue that you have in GitHub, you can assign a bounty label to it. It will go and deploy a contract on Ethereum, make a little comment on your issue. Anybody in your community can fund that issue, so it's really possible now for communities to actually put their money where their mouth is, and sort of vote for the features or fixes that they'd like to see most, and then anybody from the other side can come in, submit a pull request. If that pull request gets merged into the code base, you automatically get paid out, right? So this is about precisely building those ecosystems, right, and making sure that we can leverage these technically efficient means of sharing linguistic innovations in such a way that we can literally implement in the real world the kind of magic that will stretch the horizons of the possible and sort of take us into that adjacent world where, we've only just begun to imagine what we can really do with communities and networks like this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy.